So this stream and others like it up here on the Cumberland Plateau may offer us a glimpse into the future of what could happen when a bass gets introduced into a place where it's not supposed to be and starts impacting the natives. Here, the Redeye Bass were introduced in the early 60s, spread throughout these systems, started hybridizing with the native smallmouth bass in here, and kind of took over parts of these creeks, really, in numbers, along with the genetics. And but they seem to still be persisting in good numbers, and are generally been relatively decent neighbors, it looks like. But that is probably best case scenario, and probably often not the case. In this case, it's probably worth noting that the native species was the larger and probably more aggressive and certainly more adaptable species than the one that was introduced. Smallmouth bass obviously get much bigger. They live in lakes, reservoirs, creeks, large rivers, and Redeye bass are pretty much small stream specialists for the most part. So this is not exactly, you know, saying that, oh, everything's going to be okay. I mean, it's worth remembering that the Chattahoochee Basin down in Georgia and Alabama has had non-native bass in it for even longer than this up here, and we have total train wrecks going on down there. But how do bass handle each other? How do they adapt to each other? I mean, even when they're all native, I mean, there's 3 native species of bass in most, if not all, of these creeks. How do they coexist? Well, the most obvious way is that they basically partition the habitat and do different things. Largemouth bass are the easy ones, right? They like slower waters, they like a lot more wood. So, and that one largemouth I caught today was on exactly that scenario. Smallmouth bass are a bigger water animal in general. They like rocks, they like flow, and that's where I caught most of them today. Spotted bass are kind of more of a hybrid between those two in a way, in terms of their habitat requirements. Spotted bass typically do like flow more than largemouths, and they like wood more than they do rocks, but they don't like as much flow as smallmouth bass, and they're less found in rocks than smallmouth bass. So they kind of subdivided it that way, and we see things like that even in reservoirs. When Redeye bass arrived, what seems to have happened there is that they divided the habitat among smallmouth bass, and we'll just talk about those 2 species because that's the most common species in these creeks. So smallmouth bass are a bigger water fish than redeye bass, and so they kind of subdivided these creeks, from what I can tell, in 2 different ways. One is that in a broader scale, redeye bass are much more common in the upper portions of these creeks. They are the main dog up there, and smallmouth bass are much less common. And as you move downstream, you notice a slow shift away from redeye bass and towards smallmouth. If you keep going downstream of this, in this stream from where I'm fishing now, as the day goes on, you will notice that you start catching less and less red eyes and more smallmouth. So on the broad scale, they're dividing it that way. At a narrower scale, like up here in this area where I fished, where were most of the smallmouth? They were mostly in these bigger, deeper pools, slower water, and the redeye bass were up in water that was basically knee deep, or maybe up to your waist every once in a while, but they were in a lot of knee deep water, and that's where they really seem to do well, and better than most other black bass species. And we see the same thing in their native range. When we were working on them on the Tallapoosa River in Alabama, we saw that in the streams that flow into the Tallapoosa, they're the main bass. That's mostly what you catch. It's hard to even find Alabama bass, which is the other major native black bass species there. The Tallapoosa River, the Alabama bass were far more numerous, but the redeye bass were in these very specific areas, mostly shoal habitats, shallow shelf kind of rock, and where you found one, you found a ton, but you could go miles before you find them again. And so you see this, narrower scale subdivision of habitat, and it allows them both to persist. And they would do that in their native range, and it seems like they may have done that once they got introduced here, with smallmouth bass playing the role of the Alabama bass up here. So it's an interesting thing, and interesting concept about different habitat requirements of these bass, and it's going to play into things we're going to talk about down the road. And it certainly informs angling strategies if you're trying to catch them, or if you're trying to see how many fish, how many species can you catch in one day. Knowing their habitat differences really can help you do that, and that's one of the purposes we have for this channel.